No man wears his power so heavily as a king who would burn the world down for a child who cannot yet hold his own head up. Adrian Kessler ruled Toronto's underworld the way other men ruled boardrooms. Through silence, through fear, through the simple understanding that crossing him meant disappearing. For 3 weeks, the 8th floor of St. Augustine's private hospital had not belonged to the hospital board. It belonged to him. Men in dark wool coats stood at every stairwell, every elevator, every fire exit, vetting anyone who so much as walked too close to the neonatal wing. No one questioned it. No one dared. At 34, Adrian had buried more rivals than most men could count, and yet here he was, standing outside a glass incubator, undone by something the size of a loaf of bread. His son, Jonah, had been born 10 weeks early, ripped into the world in the same violent hour his mother had been taken from it. A car bomb meant for Adrian had found her instead, on a quiet street in Forest Hill, and the only thing he had left of her now lay tangled in wires, fighting for every breath. He had thrown every resource he owned at keeping that boy alive. The best specialists in Ontario, equipment flown in from Boston, and still, Jonah was disappearing in front of him, ounce by ounce. "Explain it to me again," Adrian said, and the chief of neonatology, Dr. Whitmore, visibly flinched. "Mr. Kessler, as I've said, preemies this small often struggle with absorption. We're maximizing his caloric intake through the TPN line, but his body isn't holding on to it. He weighed 4 pounds 9 ounces on Tuesday." Adrian's voice was low, controlled, worse for it. "Today he's 4 pounds 2. You are telling me that with every resource in this city at your disposal, you cannot stop a baby from starving in a hospital bed." He had the doctor's coat fisted in one hand before anyone in the room had even seen him move. The 2 men by the door shifted their weight, hands drifting toward their jackets. From across the room, a young nurse set down a stack of folded blankets and walked over without hurrying. "Mr. Kessler." Her voice cut clean through the tension, not loud, just certain. "Let go of him. You're raising the noise in this room, and Jonah's monitors are spiking because of it." Adrian turned. The nurse, Nora Ashby, according to the badge clipped to her scrubs, held his gaze without flinching, the way almost no one in his life ever did anymore. He looked down at the monitor over her shoulder, saw the small heart rate climbing on the screen, and slowly opened his hand. Whitmore stumbled back, gasping, muttering something about checking labs again before he all but ran from the room. Adrian dragged a hand down his face. For a moment he wasn't a man 6 bodies deep into a turf war. He was just a father standing in a room that smelled like antiseptic and grief. "He's slipping away from me," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd used anyone's name without a title attached. "Nora." She softened, stepping up beside the incubator, reaching through the porthole to rest a gloved finger against Jonah's tiny palm. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around hers. "I know it looks frightening, but he's a fighter, Mr. Kessler. I can see it." "Adrian," he corrected, watching the way she looked at his son. Not with the clinical distance of the doctors, not with the nervous pity of the other staff, but like the boy actually mattered to her. "Why is he losing weight, Nora? Tell me the truth. Is Whitmore right?" She hesitated. She'd been over Jonah's charts a dozen times in the last 2 days, and something about the pattern kept snagging at her. Malabsorption usually came with other markers: distension, abnormal liver enzymes, visible bowel distress. Jonah had none of it, just a slow, steady drain, as if the calories going into him simply evaporated. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm going to find out. I'm not going to let anything happen to him on my watch. I promise you that." Nora Ashby had not always wanted to be a nurse. She'd grown up in Scarborough, with a guitar older than she was, and a voice her grandmother swore could fill a church. And for a long time, music was the only future she could picture for herself. Then her younger brother had been born with a heart defect, and she'd spent so many nights in pediatric wards that the hospital smell stopped frightening her and started feeling like home. She'd traded stages for night shifts. She didn't regret it, not even on nights like this one. What almost nobody at St. Augustine's knew, what she'd never once put on a resume, was the 4 years before nursing school, when she'd served as a combat medic overseas, stabilizing soldiers in conditions no civilian hospital could prepare you for. She didn't talk about it. She didn't need to. It lived in her hands, in the stillness she carried into chaos, in the way she'd just walked up to a grieving Mafia boss without her pulse so much as ticking up. That night, long after Adrian had finally collapsed into a restless sleep on the leather sofa in the private waiting room, Nora sat at the nurse's station, cross-referencing Jonah's weight checks against his feeding schedule. The TPN bags were mixed fresh every 12 hours according to Whitmore's orders, pulled from a locked refrigeration unit down the hall. She plotted the weight drops against the shift changes on a scrap of paper, and a cold feeling crawled up the back of her neck. It wasn't gradual. It was episodic. Jonah's weight held steady through the day and cratered every morning at 6, right after the overnight bag had run its course. It's not malabsorption, she thought, her pulse picking up despite herself. It's induced. Someone is doing this to him. But who could get near that baby? The hallway was crawling with Adrian's men. A physical attack on the child was unthinkable. But something chemical, something hidden in a bag that already had a needle in it 12 times a day, that could slide past every gun in the building without anyone noticing. She needed proof before she said a word. Accusing the chief of neonatology of poisoning a crime boss's son without anything solid was a fast way to get herself or an innocent man killed. At 3 in the morning, with the ward quiet except for the soft rhythm of monitors, Nora made her way to the secure fridge where Jonah's feeds were stored. She found his shelf, lifted one of the milky bags to the light. The seal looked untouched, the barcode correct. She ran her thumb along the seam anyway, slow, deliberate, and felt it. A pinprick, sealed over with a dab of clear adhesive nearly invisible beneath the printed label. Someone had gone into this bag after it left the pharmacy. She drew a small sample into a syringe she'd brought from her pocket, tucked the vial away, and turned to leave, straight into a wall of muscle and expensive wool. Adrian Kessler stood in the dim hallway, the kind of stillness around him that made the air feel thinner. "What are you doing down here at 3 in the morning, Nora?" Checking inventory for his morning feed. Her hand drifted to her pocket without her meaning it to. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell espresso and cold night air on his coat. "You're a terrible liar. Your pulse is going in your throat. I can see it." His eyes, dark and unreadable, dropped to her face. "You found something." She held his gaze. Telling him now meant a body count she couldn't control. "I have a theory," she said carefully, "but if I'm right, you cannot react. You cannot do anything that tips off whoever's behind this, or they'll bury the evidence before I can prove a thing. Can you give me that? Can you trust me?" For a long moment he just looked at her, the silence stretching thin. Then he reached up, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that didn't match anything else about him. "If you save my son," he said quietly, "there is nothing I won't give you." She nodded and slipped past him toward the service stairwell, her mind already racing toward the basement lab. The pathology lab was empty at that hour. She ran the sample through the analyzer using skills she hadn't touched since a pharmacology rotation years ago, and 20 minutes later the printout told her exactly what she didn't want to know. Dinitrophenol, an industrial compound banned for human use since the 1930s, after it was pulled from the market as a diet drug that cooked people from the inside. It forced the body to burn fuel at a catastrophic rate, spiking core temperature, starving organs of energy even while the patient was technically being fed. In a baby Jonah's size, microdoses would look exactly like failure to thrive. It was invisible, it was meant to be, and it wasn't something you picked up at a corner pharmacy. Whoever was doing this had real access, hospital-grade, specialist-level access. She was halfway up the back stairwell with the bags she meant to swap for clean ones when she heard voices drifting down from the landing above. She froze in the shadows. "This is taking too long. He's starting to ask questions." She knew that voice. Marcus Doyle, Adrian's cousin, the family's second-in-command, a constant fixture at the hospital for 3 weeks under the banner of support. "I'm moving as fast as I can without it looking obvious. came a second voice, tight with irritation. Dr. Whitmore. Nora's stomach dropped through the floor. "Speed it up," Marcus said. "Catherine was supposed to die with the kid still inside her. Now we're stuck dragging this out. Adrian's falling apart. The captains are starting to wonder if he can even hold the territory. The boy dies, Adrian breaks, I step in. You get your 2 million for the clinic. Everybody wins, Richard. His organs are already starting to shut down from the caloric deficit," Whitmore whispered. "He won't make it another 2 days. Just keep Kessler distracted." It wasn't a medical mystery. It was a slow, deliberate murder, designed to look like nature taking a tragic course, and Adrian's own blood was behind it. Nora waited until the footsteps separated, Marcus heading down, Whitmore climbing toward the NICU. She knew exactly where he was going. She sprinted ahead of him, slipping into the supply closet beside the fridge to grab an evidence bag, and knocked a metal basin clattering to the floor. The door opened a second later, and Whitmore stood in the frame, looking at the lab printout shaking faintly in her hand. Something in his expression went cold and flat. "You always were too sharp for your own good," he said almost gently, drawing a pre-loaded syringe from his coat pocket. "It's a shame about the cardiac event you're about to have." He expected her to scream. He expected her to beg or freeze or run. What he got instead was a woman who'd once kept soldiers alive on a floor slick with their own blood while mortars came down around a forward base. As he lunged, Nora pivoted off her back foot inside his reach and drove the heel of her palm into his forearm hard enough to snap bone. He screamed. The syringe skittered harmlessly across the linoleum. She swept his legs out from under him and had a knee against his windpipe before he'd finished hitting the ground. "You broke your oath," she said, low and even, while his eyes bulged in panic. "And you tried to kill a baby on my shift." The door burst open behind her. 2 of Adrian's men swept in with weapons raised, and a second later Adrian himself filled the doorway, taking in the scene, the broken syringe, the sobbing doctor pinned to the tile, the composed young nurse kneeling on top of him like she did this every Tuesday. "Get up," he said, and his voice was so quiet it was almost worse than shouting. She rose slowly, never taking her eyes off Whitmore as the guards hauled him to his feet. "He's been poisoning Jonah," she said, handing Adrian the printout. "Dinitrophenol. It mimics malabsorption." This was never a medical mystery, Adrian. This was an assassination. His jaw worked. He drew a pistol from inside his coat and pressed it flat against Whitmore's forehead. "Please," Whitmore sobbed, his composure gone entirely. "It wasn't my idea. He threatened my career. He threatened my family." "Who?" Nora stepped forward and laid a hand over Adrian's, the one holding the gun. The guard stiffened, certain she'd just signed her own death warrant. Adrian didn't move, but he didn't pull the trigger either. "It was Marcus," she said quietly. "I heard them in the stairwell. He wants you broken, Adrian. He wants the family thinking you can't lead anymore, so he can take it from you while you're still grieving. If you kill Whitmore now, Marcus hears the shot or finds him missing, and he covers his tracks before you ever get a confession in front of your captains. We need him to hang himself in front of them." Adrian looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Not just gratitude, something closer to respect. He lowered the gun. "Here's what happens, Richard," he said softly to the doctor. "You go back to that NICU and you replace every poisoned bag with clean ones. My son eats real food tonight, and tomorrow at 7, you call a code blue. You tell Marcus my son is dead." Whitmore nodded frantically, tears streaming. "And if you so much as breathe a warning to him," Adrian added, voice flat as a blade, "I won't waste time on you. I'll find your sister in Halifax first." At 7 the next morning, the alarm tore through the 8th floor. Whitmore delivered the news with hollow, convincing devastation. Massive organ failure, nothing more to be done. Adrian played his part with terrible precision, smashing a glass table, burying his face in his hands while the waiting room filled with stunned, murmuring men in dark suits. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, his face arranged into mourning, though Nora, watching from the nurse's station, caught the flicker of triumph underneath it before he hid it again. "Adrian, I am so sorry." He pulled his cousin into an embrace that lasted a beat too long. This family has lost too much. Then he turned to the 6 captains gathered uneasily in their suits, and Nora watched him build his case in real time. Adrian's grief making him unfit to lead, the Volkov crews testing their southern border, the family vulnerable without someone steady at the top. "It is my duty," Marcus said, chest puffed with rehearsed solemnity, "to step up. Effective today." A few of the captains began to nod. "Is that right?" Adrian said, and the room went still at the change in his voice. No longer the broken father, but something colder and far more dangerous. He stood, straightened his jacket, and gestured toward the doorway. Nora walked in carrying Jonah, small and pink and very much breathing, wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Marcus's face drained of all color. What is this?" "Whitmore said exactly what I told him to say," Adrian said, and snapped his fingers. 2 of his men dragged the doctor in and dropped him at Marcus's feet. Adrian pulled a small recorder from his pocket and pressed play, and the supply closet confession filled the silent room. Marcus's voice, the chemical, the $2 million, the plan to starve a baby to death for a seat at the head of a table. The captains' faces shifted from grief to something far uglier. "You set me up," Marcus hissed, reaching for the gun under his jacket. He never got close to it. 4 weapons came up around him before his hand cleared his coat, and he stood frozen, surrounded by men who an hour ago had been ready to call him boss. "You went after a child," Adrian said quietly, stepping close enough that his voice was the only thing in the room. "You're not family. You're nothing." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The 2 captains who dragged Marcus out didn't need instructions twice, and his screaming cut off the moment the services elevator doors closed. To Whitmore, still sobbing on the carpet, Adrian's voice was almost bored. "A federal judge who owes me a favor is going to hear about your fraud, and you're going to plead to all of it. You'll spend a long time somewhere, I have friends. Make your peace with that." When the room finally emptied, it was just Adrian, Nora, and the sleeping baby between them. He crossed to her slowly, the danger draining out of him with every step until there was only a man who hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks, looking at her like she'd handed him something he'd thought was already gone. "You saved everything," he said. "I was just doing my job." She smiled, tired but steady. "Somebody had to look out for him. You did more than that." His hand came up to cup her jaw, thumb tracing along it gently. "You stood down a killer. You stood down me. I owe you a debt I can't repay. Name it." She looked up at him, at the danger and the devotion tangled together in the same face, and felt something in her chest she hadn't expected to feel again after years of guarding it carefully. "Then you're just going to have to let me stick around," she said quietly, "and make sure you don't get yourself killed." Something rare moved across his face, something that looked almost boyish. "I think that can be arranged." 3 months later, the Kessler family pediatric wing opened its doors at St. Augustine's, fully funded, its director of nursing a sharp-eyed woman who never let a chart go unquestioned. Jonah Kessler grew loud and stubborn and impossibly healthy, safe in his father's arms, watched over by the woman who had refused to look away when everyone else had.